You know what I did last summer? I complained. I complained every single day. My air conditioner was making this little rattling noise, and I kept telling my son, something is wrong with this machine. It is not cooling the way it should. And he looked at me very patiently in the way you look at someone you love who is being a little dramatic. And he said, Mom, it is still 68 degrees in here. And I said, yes, but it does not feel like 68. And he just walked away, and I don't blame him. But here is what made me stop and think. I was complaining about my home feeling slightly less cool than I prefer on a day when it was 92 degrees outside. And then I thought about my grandmother and her mother before her, and the millions of people who lived for thousands of years on this planet without a single button to press, without a single electric hum, without a single thermostat on the wall. And they survived. They didn't just survive. They lived full, rich lives. They slept, they cooked, they worked, they loved people, they grew old. So how did they do it? That question sent me down a rabbit hole that completely changed how I see my own home, my own habits, and honestly, how I see human beings altogether. Because what I found was not a story about suffering, it was a story about genius, quiet, everyday, beautiful genius. And I want to share every piece of it with you today. So stay with me, because by the end of this, you are going to look at an open window or a shady tree in your yard or a big front porch on an old house, and you are going to see it completely differently. I promise you that. Let us go all the way back. And I mean all the way back, 4,000 years ago in the burning heat of ancient Egypt. Imagine you are living along the Nile River. The summer sun is so relentless that the sand itself feels like it is on fire. You have no electricity. You have no metal ducts in the ceiling, but you do have something remarkable. You have a reed mat and you have water. And someone, somewhere, at some point, thousands of years ago, figured something out. If you take that reed mat, soak it in water, and hang it across your doorway, the air that passes through it becomes noticeably cooler. That is it. That is the whole trick. And it works because of something we now call evaporative cooling. When water evaporates, it pulls heat out of the air. It is the exact same reason you feel cold when you step out of a swimming pool on a breezy day. The ancient Egyptians had no word for the science, but they absolutely understood the result: cool doorways, cool homes. And a people who built one of the greatest civilizations the world has ever seen in the middle of a desert, in temperatures that would make most of us want to lie down and not get up. Now, let me take you east a little bit to ancient Persia, which is the country we now call Iran. And this is where I personally think some of the most jaw-dropping ingenuity in all of human history happened. The Persians built these tall tower structures on top of their homes called badgirs, which translates quite literally to wind catchers. And when I first read about these, I genuinely sat back in my chair and said out loud, wait, they did what? Here is how they worked. These towers were built facing the direction of the prevailing wind in that region. They had openings at different levels, and the design of the tower would catch even a small breeze, funnel it downward into the building, and circulate cool air through the rooms. But that was only half of it. Many Persian homes also had underground aqueducts called qanats, which were long channels that brought water from distant mountain sources underneath the earth. That underground water stayed cold even in the hottest summer. The badgir above would pull warm air down, and the qanat below would cool it before it entered the living space. They were running cold water under their homes and catching wind above them to create a passive air conditioning system that required zero electricity, zero machinery, and zero rattling noises. The city of Yazd in Iran still has these wind catchers standing today. People still live in homes they were designed for. I find that almost unbelievable. And then the ancient Romans got involved. And of course, when Rome does something, it goes big. Wealthy Romans had access to an enormous aqueduct system that moved cold spring water from miles and miles away into the city. And while most of that water was for drinking and bathing, some Romans piped it through the walls of their homes, cold water running through the walls. It is not so different in principle from what we do today. It is just that they were doing it 2,000 years ago using gravity and stone and sheer engineering will. For the average Roman citizen who could not afford that kind of private plumbing, there was something else. The design of Roman homes themselves was built around cooling. They had a central open courtyard called an atrium with an opening in the roof. Hot air would rise and escape through that opening, which pulled cooler air in from the lower rooms and the surrounding outdoor space. The house breathed. It was designed to breathe. Every morning I wake up and press a button, and my home breathes for me. Those Romans were doing it architecturally with nothing but knowledge and intention. But it wasn't only the Romans. All over the ancient world, people were building cooling into their structures in ways that we completely abandoned once we had machines to do the job for us. In Cappadocia, in what is now central Turkey, entire communities carved their homes out of volcanic rock underground, not because they were hiding, not because they were afraid, but because the ground, just a few feet below the surface, maintains a temperature that barely changes regardless of what is happening above. You go underground, and you are automatically in a space that stays somewhere around 55 to 60 degrees year round. They had stone furniture, stone beds, stone floors, and a constant natural coolness that no amount of Egyptian cotton sheets could replicate. In traditional Indian architecture, you see something equally remarkable. Buildings like the Hawa Mahal in Jaipur, which is one of the most beautiful buildings I have ever seen pictures of, and I hope someday I see it in person. It has nearly 1,000 small windows arranged in an intricate lattice work of stone. The name literally means Palace of the Winds. Each tiny window creates a channel for air movement. The whole building acts like a breathing, cooling machine made entirely of stone and design intention. No moving parts, no filters to change, no technician to call. Now let us move forward in time and come to America, because this is where the story gets really personal and really specific, and honestly a little heartbreaking before it gets wonderful. By the early and middle 1800s in America, there was a booming industry that most people today have completely forgotten about. It was called the ice trade, and it was enormous. Men would go out in the winter to frozen ponds and lakes, mostly in New England, and they would cut massive blocks of ice, sometimes weighing hundreds of pounds, using specially designed saws. Those blocks would be hauled out and packed in straw and sawdust, which insulated them, and stored in carefully built ice houses. And then they would be shipped by cart, by river barge, by railroad across the country, even overseas. A man named Frederick Tudor was so serious about the ice trade that people called him the Ice King. He shipped New England ice to India, to Cuba, to places that had never touched frozen water in their lives. He made an absolute fortune. Back home, families who could afford it had an ice box in their kitchen, not a refrigerator. An ice box. It was literally a wooden box, insulated with metal or sometimes cork on the inside, and you would put a big block of ice in the top compartment, and the cold air would sink down and keep your food in the lower compartment from spoiling. And the iceman would come by your house on a regular schedule to deliver a new block as the old one melted. Children used to chase the ice wagon down the street in summer to grab the little chips that fell off. That was the treat. That was summer. Ice chips from the Iceman's wagon. Think about that industry for just a second. Hundreds of thousands of people employed in cutting, storing, transporting, and delivering frozen water. An entire economy built around the simple human need to stay cool. And it lasted for about 150 years before machines took over the job. Now, what were people doing inside their homes during all of this? Because ice was expensive and not every family could afford regular deliveries. Most families in America in the 1800s and early 1900s were working with what they had. And what they had was their house, their trees, their instincts, and their common sense. Houses back then were designed with cooling in mind in ways that most modern homes simply are not. And I notice this every time I drive through an older neighborhood. Those beautiful old homes with the big wraparound porches. You might think those porches are just decorative. They are not. That porch is a shade machine. When the sun hits the side of your house directly, it heats up the walls and the heat radiates inward. A porch roof intercepts that sun before it ever reaches the wall. It creates a buffer zone of shade. And because porch floors are raised and open underneath, air can circulate below them, which keeps the adjacent rooms noticeably cooler. Sitting on a porch was not just leisure. It was temperature management. And then there were the windows. I know that sounds so basic, but the windows in old houses were designed in a way that we have almost completely abandoned. They were called double hung windows, and here is why they matter. Heat rises. We all know that. So in a room with double hung windows, you could lower the top sash and raise the bottom sash at the same time. The hot air near the ceiling would escape out the top. Cooler air would come in at the bottom. You were engineering a small, continuous airflow in your own room, using nothing but the physics of heat and a bit of strategy. And the taller the window, the better it worked, which is exactly why you see those tall, dramatic windows in Victorian homes from the second half of the 1800s. People were not just trying to be fancy. They were trying to stay cool. Above the interior doors in many of those old homes, there were also small windows called transoms. Even if you closed your bedroom door at night for privacy, the transom above it would allow air to keep moving between rooms. The whole house was designed as a connected breathing system. And above all of that was the attic fan, or as they called it in the South and Midwest, the whole house fan. You installed this large fan in your ceiling, usually in a central hallway, and you opened your windows in the evening when the air outside had finally cooled down, and you turned that fan on. It pulled all the hot air that had built up in your home throughout the day up through the ceiling and out through the attic vents, while simultaneously pulling the cool evening air in through every open window in the house. The whole house would cool down in 20 minutes. That fan used about 90% less energy than a central air system. People loved those fans. I have talked to older folks who will tell you they slept better under a whole house fan than they have slept under anything since. And then there were the sleeping porches. I think sleeping porches might be my favorite thing I discovered in all of this research. When the night was still too hot to sleep indoors, families would move to a screened-in porch, usually on the second floor or at the back of the house, where three sides were open to the night air. You would put your bed out there, your sheets, your pillow, and you would sleep under the open sky with the breeze moving across you. At the turn of the 20th century, this was so common and so valued that builders were putting sleeping porches on houses from New York to California. President William Howard Taft had a sleeping porch built on the roof of the White House in 1910. The President of the United States was sleeping outside on a screened porch because it was the best way to stay cool. That fact makes me love that era a little bit. In the cellar, which most older homes had, families stored their perishable food because the ground below the frost line stays naturally cool. Root vegetables, preserves, dairy, meat, all of it went down into that cellar where the temperature hovered around 50 degrees even in August. It was not glamorous, but it was smart. They were using the earth itself as a refrigerator. And the trees. I want to talk about the trees because I feel like we have completely forgotten what trees do for a home. A large deciduous tree, that's the kind that loses its leaves in winter, planted on the south or west side of your house can reduce the temperature inside your home by up to 20 degrees. 20 degrees, not 2. 20. And in the winter, because it has dropped its leaves, the sun can still come through and warm your home. Our great-grandparents knew exactly where to plant their trees. They planned it. They thought generationally. They planted trees knowing that it would be their children and grandchildren who sat in the full shade of them. That is a kind of patience and long-term thinking that I find genuinely moving. Now, I have to tell you about the people who had none of this. Because while wealthy families had their sleeping porches and their ice boxes and their shade trees, poor families in crowded city neighborhoods had almost nothing. And this is the part of the history that is hard to sit with. In New York City in 1896, there was a catastrophic heat wave. Temperatures stayed above 90 degrees for more than 10 consecutive days. And in the tenement neighborhoods where poor immigrant families were packed 8 and 10 to a room in buildings with no ventilation, no shade, and no ice, the death toll was staggering. Over 1,500 people died in New York City alone, mostly elderly people, mostly babies and young children. The city eventually started opening police stables, which had better airflow than the tenements, so that people could sleep there at night. Some families climbed out onto fire escapes and slept there. Others went to the parks, others lay on the rooftops. And this was not a one-time event. In 1901, a heat wave killed over 4,000 people across the eastern United States. In 1936, at the height of the Dust Bowl and the Great Depression, a North American heat wave killed more than 5,000 people, and air conditioning existed by then. It had been invented in 1902 by a brilliant young engineer named Willis Haviland Carrier. But it was expensive and enormous and meant for factories and printing plants, not homes. Only about 10% of American households had air conditioning as late as 1960. That means in 1960, 9 out of 10 families in this country were still using all the old tricks to get through the summer. So when exactly did the world change? It happened gradually after World War II, when manufacturing scaled up, when Carrier and other companies began producing window unit air conditioners that individual families could actually afford. Sales exploded in the 1950s, and by the 1970s and 1980s, central air conditioning had become so standard in new American homes that builders simply stopped thinking about where to put the porch. They stopped thinking about which direction the windows should face. They stopped planting strategic trees. They stopped designing transoms and whole house fans into the plans, because why bother when the machine will just handle it? And here is what gets me. Here is the thing that I have been thinking about since I started digging into all of this. We did not just get air conditioning, we forgot 4,000 years of accumulated human wisdom about how to live comfortably in a hot world. We traded that knowledge in, and a lot of us do not even know we did it. The ancient Egyptians understood evaporative cooling. The Persians understood passive airflow and the physics of wind. The Romans understood water as a temperature regulator. The builders of the 1800s understood shade and window placement and the direction of the summer breeze. Every one of those things still works exactly the same way today as it did then. The science did not change. We just stopped teaching it and we stopped building for it. I think about that a lot. As a former teacher, I spent 30 years trying to get young people to understand that the past is not irrelevant, that the people who came before us were not primitive or simple, that they figured things out in the absence of every convenience we take for granted, and they figured them out beautifully. And every time the power goes out in the summer now, and I am sitting there sweating, I do not feel helpless anymore. I think about reed mats in doorways. I think about wind towers above Persian rooftops. I think about sleeping porches and shade trees and the Iceman's wagon coming down the street. Those people survived. They built civilizations. They loved their families and made their meals and went to sleep at night without a single thermostat. And honestly, that gives me a lot of hope. If you enjoyed this, and if any piece of this changed the way you see an old house or a shady tree or even just an open window on a cool evening, then please share this with someone because this kind of history is worth keeping alive. And I will see you in the next one.